All right, our next speaker is pretty awesome. Our next speaker is very awesome. She is an awesome blogger, awesome activist, just really smart, very awesome. And she's from San Francisco as well, and Greta Christina, everyone.
First of all, is this thing on? People can hear me okay? Thank you, Kevin, for that awesome introduction. I'm Greta Christina. I blog at Greta Christina's blog, and I'm the author of Why Are You Atheists So Angry? 99 Things That Piss Off the Godless. Available in the lobby, and also available on audiobook and ebook. But that's not actually what I'm going to talk about today. Today I'm talking about atheism and sex. By the way, oddly enough, this talk about atheism and sexuality does talk about sex, explicitly in some places. Now is a good time to make an informed decision about whether that's something you're comfortable listening to. And also, if you have kids, now is a good time to make an informed decision about whether you're comfortable having your kids listen to me talk explicitly sometime about sex. So I am here today to talk about atheism and sexuality. And unsurprisingly, to anybody who understands how evolution works, sex is one of the most important and most powerful aspects of the human experience. And religion has gotten to control the conversation about sex. It's gotten to control the conversation about everything for hundreds and indeed thousands of years. And if atheists are going to work towards a world in which atheism is both more accepted and more common, we need to offer some secular ways of dealing with sex. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about some of the ways that we can be sexual without a religious framework. And I'm going to be breaking that up into two parts. First, I'm going to talk about how atheists can view sexual morality without belief in God. And then I'm going to talk about how atheists can view sexual transcendence without a belief in the supernatural. But before I talk about atheism and sexuality, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about religion and sexuality, to talk about what exactly it is that we're up against and what exactly it is that we're offering an alternative to. So the first religious view of sex that I'm going to talk about is the view of most traditional religions, especially the more traditional versions of the Abrahamic religions. It's by far the most common, and that view is God cares who you have sex with and how. God only wants you to have sex with certain people, typically a person of the opposite sex to whom you're married, although that can vary within religions. You know, some religions, for instance, permit same-sex marriage, and some religions ban sex entirely. Not surprisingly, those religions don't last too long. Important tip, if you're trying to start a religion and you want it to last more than a generation, don't make procreation a sin. And God only wants you to have certain kinds of sex. Even within religiously sanctioned marriage, religious restrictions against the kinds of sex you can have include restrictions against oral sex, anal sex, sex using birth control, ejaculation outside the vagina, sex with a woman who's menstruating, the use of pornography and erotica, cross-dressing, even some non-sexual activities like dancing are sometimes prohibited by religions because they can potentially lead to sex. Now, if these restrictions were based on fundamental human ethics or even just practical considerations, you would expect them to be at least somewhat similar across every religion. You wouldn't expect them to be identical, but you'd expect to see some similarities. But that's really not what we find. I mean, there are a couple of common themes. You know, sex that's likely to result in procreation with an opposite sex partner you're legally married to. That's usually on God's yes list. But throughout history and across different cultures, when we look at religious taboos on sex, what we see is a ridiculously wide range. For instance, some religions are pretty okay with the standard variations such as oral or anal sex, as long as it stays within marriage. Others believe that God frowns on any sort of sexuality other than what the sex educators refer to as PIV, or penis in vagina intercourse. And still other religions believe that certain variations are okay, but they frown on others. You know, some religions say, for instance, oral sex, well, sure, God thinks that's fine, but anal sex, are you kidding? God thinks that's disgusting. And of course, very famously, different religions have different beliefs about how these rules should be applied to women versus men. I mean, of course, the sexual double standard is depressingly common across, many religions, but the details of how this double standard gets applied vary wildly. Is the punishment for adultery the same for women and for men? Are the rules about interfaith marriage the same for women and men? Are the rules about divorce the same for women and men? Is monogamy required for both women and men, or are men, encouraged and indeed required to have multiple wives? Different religions answer all these questions very differently. And even the question of who it's okay to marry, who it's okay to have this permissible marital sex with, varies hugely from different religions. Different religions have different rules about how old you have to be to get married, how closely you can be related, whether you can have been married before or whether marriage is a one-time deal, whether you have to be of the same religion or not, and even how many people you can marry. And what's more, and I actually think very importantly, some religious restrictions on sex only address sexual behavior. They only ban what you do sexually with your bodies. Well, other religions and other religious restrictions on sex, they don't just cover sexual behaviors, they cover forbidden sexual thoughts and forbidden sexual desires. And they have this idea that God isn't just angry when you have prohibited sex, God is angry when you just think about prohibited sex. And when you think about it, this is not some fringe theology. This is the core of, for instance, Christianity. Consider the loving and compassionate teaching of Jesus, or who I've lately taken to calling the Jesus character in the New Testament now. The teaching that lusting in your heart is every bit as sinful as committing adultery with your body. And it's basically creating a thought crime. I have a hard time looking at this teaching and thinking of it as anything other than a thought crime. And having this kind of religious thought crime has this very ugly effect of making people feel guilty and dirty for something that they can't help, for physical desires that have been deeply hardwired into us by hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Have any of you ever read any of the writings of the Christmas underwear bomber? First of all, do you remember who the Christmas underwear bomber is? A few years ago, this extremist Islamicist terrorist tried to blow up an airplane by strapping explosives into his underwear. It's worth reading his writings, actually. When you're done here, Google Christmas underwear bomber. Because his writings they're kind of this fascinating window into a certain kind of religious extremism, but particularly a certain kind of religious extremism that's driven by sexual guilt. This person was tortured with religious guilt over sexual feelings that he believed were sinful. He had some guilt over some forbidden sexual acts as well, such as, oh my goodness, he didn't lower his gaze in the presence of women. But he was also tormented with guilt over just simple sexual desires. And we're not actually talking in this case about sexual desires that were in any way unethical, or that were even particularly unusual. As far as we know, this guy was not into spanking, this guy was not into Jell-O, this guy was not into humping women on the subway. And as far as we know, this guy was not even gay. The mere fact that he, as a man, found women sexually attractive and was aroused by looking at them and aroused by being in their presence, this was enough to torment him with terrible religious guilt and terrible fear that he was disappointing and angering his God. I mean, when you think about this, this is like making people feel guilty for being hungry. This is like making people feel guilty for feeling like they have to go to sleep. And this kind of religious guilt over sexual feelings, this teaching that certain sexual feelings and thoughts and desires are sinful, that's not a necessary part of religious sexual morality. It's not something that all religions do. Only some of the really super special ones. And very often, the sexual ethics of a religion, they're not just inconsistent with the sexual ethics of other religions. They're inconsistent with themselves. They are internally inconsistent. For instance, take the moral lesson conveyed by so many conservative Christian teachings. Sex is dirty and bad, and you should save it for the person you love. Sex is so dangerous. The desire for it can just, even talking about it can send a desire for it spinning out of control. It is wicked. It is disgusting. You should not even think about it until your wedding night. Which, if you were good little boys and girls and you hung on to your cherry, will be a glorious pinnacle of sacred Okay, so now this teaching doesn't just conflict with the teachings of different religions, and it doesn't even just conflict with some basic realities about human sexuality, such as the reality that, hey, you know what, first times usually aren't that great. It conflicts with itself. It is internally inconsistent. So clearly, when we look at religious restrictions about sexuality, we are not looking at a straightforward, unambiguous message from God. And we're not even looking at a solid set of clearly thought out moral positions based on consistent ethical principles. What we're looking at is an almost random set of taboos. And they're taboos that really kind of make no more sense than the taboos we have about food or about drugs. There's many anthropologists, the one that I remember from when I was in college was Mary Douglas, have argued that the point of taboos is to give people the feeling of control, the illusion of control, over powerful and important areas of our lives. And that this human need for taboos is psychologically more important than the actual specifics of what those taboos are or whether they're rational or practical. And that's exactly what religious restrictions on sex look like. You know, they're really only peripherally about ethical matters, you know, such as who's harmed or what's fair. They're really only peripherally about even practical matters, such as ensuring reproduction or maintaining the purity of the genetic line. They're about making people feel like they have control over sex, you know, by drawing an essentially arbitrary line between good sex and bad sex, and convincing themselves that this line was drawn by God. Okay, now granted, there are some more progressive and moderate versions of these traditional religions, you know, Reform Judaism and progressive Christianity and so on, who don't believe in this, they don't believe in God's checklist, you know, they don't believe in God's yes or no checklist. You know, they believe that God doesn't really care that much about the details of what you're doing in bed and with whom, you know, as long as what you're doing is, you know, consensual and affectionate and everybody's happy. These aren't the most common versions of these religions, but they're not unheard of either. And for these more progressive believers, in a day-to-day practical sense, their sexual ethics look a lot like secular sexual ethics. They look a lot like atheist sexual ethics. They're not based on what's going to make God happy or unhappy. You know, they're based on what makes people happy or unhappy. Yeah, but even these more progressive Christians, Jews, and Muslims and so on, they still believe that morality comes from God. You know, they believe that our moral compass was instilled in us by God, that we can make our decisions based on this moral compass, but they think that that morality was put in us by God, including our moral compass about sex. And obviously, atheists don't believe that, and we're not going to base our sexual morality on it. So, what is the atheist alternative to all of this? You know, if we don't believe that God is peeking into our bedroom and taking notes, you know, if we don't even think that there is a God, much less one who cares who and how we're fucking, what do we base our sexual morality on? You know, without God, are we just looking at a sybaritic sexual free-for-all, totally uninhibited by any ethical constraints? And those people out there going, please say yes. I'm very sorry to disappoint you, but the answer is no. And of course, being serious, we would want the answer to be no. You know, in all seriousness, we don't actually want to live a sexual life that's not ethical. We don't want a sexual life where we don't care who's hurt. You know, of course, without a belief in God, we still have sexual ethics. But without belief in God, we're free to base our sexual ethics on, wait for it, ethics. I know, wild, huh? You know, we don't have to base these sexual ethics on what somebody else wrote down thousands of years ago about what God supposedly told them about how he does and doesn't want us to do the nasty. You know, human beings seem to have some core ethical values hardwired into our brains from millions of years of evolution as a social species. You know, this is a somewhat controversial view, but it's gaining a lot more ground. To some degree, the core ethical values seem to be hardwired into us through evolution. And you know, there's certainly other animals that have ethics, other animals that have altruism. You know, it seems to be this thing that social animals do. And then, of course, we hammer out the specifics and the finer points of these kind of basic values based on the standards that our particular society teaches us, and also just based on our own experience and our own observation of what hurts people and what helps people, and what's fair and unfair, and what keeps society running more or less smoothly. And that's what we can base our sexual ethics on. We don't have to worry about questions like, does God think anal sex is gross? Instead, we can look at questions like consent, honesty, fairness, and harm. So let's look at a few specific examples of how this plays out. Let's start with a no-brainer, or with what I profoundly hope in this crowd is a no-brainer. Let's look at the question, is homosexuality moral? And instead of answering that question by saying, homosexuality is immoral because gay sex makes baby Jesus cry. Instead, we can ask questions like, is anyone harmed by homosexuality? Is homosexuality consensual? Do homosexual relationships injure society in any way? Is it fair or just to have different rules for same-sex relationships than we do for opposite-sex ones? So let's look at a different example, one with somewhat less obvious answers. Let's look at a question like, is pornography moral? And again, instead of saying, our God prohibits us from viewing sexually explicit material, instead of looking at God's yes or no checklist, we can ask questions like, is there any good evidence about how pornography tends to affect people on average? Is there any good evidence that pornography affects people negatively or positively, or is that effect more or less neutral? Is the effect of different kinds of pornography different? We can ask questions like, is there any good evidence that pornography contributes to sexism and misogyny any more than any other aspect of popular culture in a sexist society? Is there any evidence that pornography contributes to sexism any more than, say, television or movies or video games or popular music or whatever? We can ask questions like, can we acknowledge the right to freedom of sexual expression while still critiquing the particular ways that porn frequently plays out in our culture? And one more example before I move on. We can look at a question like, what kinds of sexual limits should there be within a relationship or a marriage? And instead of saying something like, well, God thinks anal sex is gross, so I guess we're not doing that, we can ask questions like, is this consensual? Do both partners or all partners, depending on what kind of relationship you have, does everybody involved want to do this? Is this sex act relatively safe, or is it likely to cause harm? And if this sex act is more risky, is everybody involved capable of consenting to that risk? Is everybody involved, well informed about this risk and psychologically and emotionally mature and capable of taking that risk? And if partners disagree about a particular sex act, how do they resolve those differences? So when we're asking these questions and when we're answering them, I think that there's a couple of basic principles that atheists can base our moral decisions on. One is that we have to allow our sexual morality to be nuanced. When we let go of God's checklist, when we let go of religious taboos on particular sexual acts or arrangements, we have to start viewing sexual ethics more on a case-by-case basis. And while, certainly there's some sexual acts that can be clearly defined as ethical or unethical by pretty much anybody who's not a sociopath, rape and child molestation being the obvious examples, there's a lot of sexual acts and sexual arrangements that fall into a more gray area, where different values come into conflict. So here's an example of this. Let's look at an example of a monogamous marriage where one spouse has decided they don't want to have sex anymore at all, ever again. They're not willing to negotiate, they're not willing to go to couples counseling, and they're not willing to consider non-monogamy. They're not willing to consider opening the relationship up. As far as they're concerned, the fact that they're done with sex means their partner is done with sex too. And I'm not talking here about a situation where somebody's just temporarily, because of illness or depression, or they recently had a baby, they're like, I don't want to have sex for a while. I mean, they're done with sex for life. And in case you're thinking that this is like this made-up hypothetical situation, the kind that philosophy teachers make up to torture you and make you think. Unfortunately, this situation is depressingly common. If you read the sex advice columns, you see it all the time. And it's not actually particularly gender-based. There's a lot of people who assume that it's always a woman who's turning off the tap and it's always the man who's deprived. That's not the case. The situation happens in same-sex relationships, and it happens in relationships with people who don't identify with gender binary, and it happens in opposite-sex relationships in both directions. It is often the case where it's the man who's saying, yeah, I'm done with sex, forget about it, and it's the woman who's saying, hey, I didn't sign on for that. So in this situation, is it morally wrong for one person in this monogamous relationship stop having sex? And is it morally wrong for the other partner, for the deprived partner, to seek sex outside the marriage or outside the relationship? Okay, so we have two conflicting moral values here. As any philosophy teacher will tell you, that's when morality gets really interesting, when you have two conflicting moral values. On the one hand, do people have the right to say no to sex? Yes, absolutely. People have the right to say no to sex. They have the right to say no to any particular kind of sex, or to sex entirely. They have the right to say that permanently or temporarily. You know, we own our bodies. Actually, I gave this talk once and somebody said, actually, if you're a materialist, you don't think you own your body, you think you are your body. We are our bodies, and we have the right to have autonomy over our bodies. But do people have the right to non-consensually eradicate other people's sex lives? I don't think so. And in fact, I would argue that the reason for that is pretty much the same as the reason for the other. We own our bodies. We are our bodies. Other people don't have the right to turn off our sexuality. Now, you might argue that the other partner, the deprived partner, the one who's being denied sex, they could always leave the marriage. But what if that's a morally problematic choice? You know, what if you have kids together, and what if you have a business together, and breaking up the marriage is going to affect people other than just the two of you? What if one partner is financially dependent on the other, you know, for health insurance or other reasons? Okay, so my point in raising this question is not actually to settle it here today. I do have my own opinions on it, but actually my main opinion about this is that this is a really thorny ethical question, and that's exactly my point in raising it. My point is when we move away from strict religious taboos and rules about specific sexual acts and arrangements, when we move away from God's yes or no checklist, you know, rules such as adultery is always wrong, or people are always obligated to have sex with their spouses, both of which are rules that exist in real religions. When we move away from that, we have to accept that there's going to be sexual situations that are complicated ethical questions. You know, questions that aren't easy to answer, and questions that good and honorable people are going to disagree about. We have to be willing to make difficult moral choices, and we have to accept the responsibility for those choices without pawning it off on God. Okay, so that's one key ingredient of an atheist sexual morality, accepting the reality of moral nuance, acknowledging that sexual choices can be difficult with no one clear choice, accepting responsibility for those choices. Related to that is the idea that we have to not make our sexual decisions by default. There's way too many people who take major, serious steps in their sexual lives based on this external social timetable, you know, without considering whether this is really the right time for them to take that step, or whether they even want to take that step at all. You know, there's way too many people who decide when in a relationship to stop seeing other people, when to start having sex, when to move in together, when to get married, when to have kids. Not because it's what's right for them, without even really carefully thinking about what's right for them. But just because there's this external social timetable, that that's what's next, that's what's done. It's been a few months, it's time for us to move in together. And many people think of these sexual steps in terms of when to do them, without considering whether to do them. You know, we have choices about whether to move in together, whether to stop seeing other people, whether to get married, whether to even get into a serious relationship at all, or whether perhaps being single is best for us, temporarily or permanently. Making these decisions by default without careful consideration of what's right for you, it's not fair to yourself, and it's really not fair to your partner. Letting these major, really personal decisions be made by social consent is a recipe for free-floating resentment. It is a recipe for feeling trapped in a situation that you feel like you're totally trapped into this because you kind of trap yourself into it because you didn't think carefully about whether this was right for you. That's not responsible, and taking responsibility for your sexual choices is a major part of the secular sexual ethic. Another really important part of an atheist sexual morality is that we have to be reality-based. Atheists sometimes like to call ourselves the reality-based community. If we're going to live up to that, we have to apply it to sex as well. You know, we don't get to just say same-sex marriage will destroy the family. We have to give evidence of how same-sex marriage affects families. You know, how do kids of same-sex marriages turn out? What effect does same-sex marriages have on society and neighborhoods and so on? You know, we don't get to just say porn desensitizes people and teaches them to treat their sex partners as objects. We have to look at the evidence about how does porn affect people who watch it. Does occasional porn consumption affect people differently from very frequent porn consumption, and so on. You know, when we're evaluating sexual ethics of a particular act or arrangement, we have to practice good, evidence-based practices. And that includes being willing to change our minds. A couple of years ago, I was in an online debate with an atheist, and this is again with an atheist, about polyamory. Polyamory, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, it means a consensual, mutually agreed upon situation where people have sexual and or romantic relationships with one or more person at a time. You know, poly meaning many, amory meaning love, polyamory. Some people don't like the word, it mixes Greek and Latin roots, and some people don't like that. Some other words meaning roughly the same thing are non-monogamy or multiple relationships or open relationships. Polyamory or poly is kind of the word that people who do this are converging on, so that's mostly what it means. So anyway, this atheist in this debate, this is on the Daily Atheism blog, was insisting that polyamorous relationships were inherently unequal and selfish because of the inequity of what he called the standard polyamory setup. You know, a harem-type arrangement where there's one person with multiple partners, and those multiple partners don't interact sexually with each other or with anybody outside the relationship. You know, like old-fashioned Mormon polygamy, you know, that kind of thing. Okay, so as pointed out to this person in this debate many times, that there is no such thing as a standard polyamory setup. that this concept of a standard polyamory setup was one that he had personally pulled out of his own ass. You know, that in fact, you know, pretty much every polyamorous relationship has a different arrangement. You know, it's tailored to meet the needs of the people involved in it. You know, there's a few kind of basic, broad, rough templates, but you know, there's lots of different arrangements. And in fact, those arrangements will often change during time and over the relationship as people's needs change. In fact, lots of polyamorous people will tell you about those arrangements at great length. If you want an example of that, go onto YouTube and look up shit poly people say. It's high fucking. But so anyway, so the person making this argument refused to change his position, very stubbornly continued to defend it. And this actually wasn't just a single-time incident. This happened a couple years ago, but just a couple weeks ago on my own blog. Very similar situation. I was writing about polyamory, and this person came in writing, you know, polyamory is terrible. The people who do it are greedy. They're selfish. They're not really interested in a real connection. They're just using other people. Monogamy is always better. It's always better for raising kids. It's always healthier. And lots of people who, with experience with polyamory and non-monogamy, came out and said, "What are you talking about?" You know. And what came out was this person had personally had one bad experience with polyamory with a partner who was a controlling jerk and was therefore extrapolating from that one data point that all polyamorous relationships were bad. That is not good humanist or atheist sexual morality. We need to be willing to change our minds when we're confronted with evidence that contradicts it. And the story points up another principle. When it comes to sex, we need to be willing to listen to the people who are actually having the kind of sex that we're considering. There are way too many people who are willing to make moral judgments about gays and lesbians, porn consumers, porn performers, non-monogamists, consensual sadomasochists, transgendered people, asexual people, sex workers, sex work customers, without ever talking with these people. You know, without reading the writings of these people, you know, without doing the 10 minutes of Googling where you type in asexuality or consensual sadomasochism into Google, spend 10 minutes, you know, reading what it is that people who practice this kind of sex say about it themselves. That's not good humanist sexual morality. We need to not prioritize our own prejudices about a particular kind of sex at the cost of ignoring the people who actually engage in it. Now, we don't necessarily have to agree with these people. You know, I've gotten into conversations with people about kind of sex we're practicing. You know, I've done reading about it. I've gotten into conversations, listened to them, asked them questions, and at the end of those conversations, decided, actually, no, I think what you're doing is fucked up. We don't necessarily have to agree with them, but we have to listen. We have to consider the possibility that maybe they know more about their sex lives than we do. And very importantly related to this, we have to remember that media depictions of alternative sexualities are often inflammatory and sensationalist. We have to not assume that we know everything there is to know about, SM or sex work because we read this one article about it in the newspaper. All of which leads me to my final principle of an atheist and humanist approach to sexual morality. Actually, predict that line, not my final principle. My final principle for today, I could gas on about this all night. But my final principle for today, we need to not make moral judgments about sexuality purely on the basis of what grosses us out. This is a surprisingly difficult principle for many people to grasp, including atheists. This idea that personal revulsion is a good barometer of moral revulsion, it is very common. It's very common for people to think, I am really personally upset by the idea of homosexuality, the idea of non-monogamy, the idea of consensual sadomasochism, the idea of sex work or whatever. Therefore, these things are immoral and nobody else should do them. For instance, look at the arguments that are commonly marshaled against homosexuality. God forbids it, it makes baby Jesus cry, that's obviously at the top of the list. But a close second is anal sex is disgusting. And as a moral foundation, these two arguments make about as much sense as each other, which is to say, none. It's a really dumb argument against homosexuality anyway, because lots of gay people don't practice anal sex, and lots of straight people do. So here's a useful way of looking at this question. I've personally found when I'm pondering some question of sexual ethics, it's often useful to make a non-sexual analogy. Our feelings about sex do tend to run very strong, they run very deep, they're not always rational, for reasons of cultural training, but also very likely for just some reasons of biology and evolution as well. So when we're pondering questions of sexual ethics, it often helps to take it out of a sexual context, to make a non-sexual analogy. So it's not our lizard hindbrain doing the thinking. And when it comes to this question of whether personal revulsion should translate into moral revulsion, I like to do what I call the broccoli test. I personally am revolted by broccoli. I really, seriously and profoundly nauseated. I cannot be in the room when it's being cooked. Even a small amount of it in food makes me ill. Even standing up here talking about it makes me really queasy. But I don't think that people who do like broccoli are immoral. I don't try to talk people out of eating broccoli. I don't try to get laws passed banning broccoli. I'm not out there, in front of the farmer's market every Saturday with a ticket sign with a picture of broccoli and a big slash circle. I don't make broad moral generalizations about the kind of people who eat broccoli. I don't avoid friendships and relationships with people who eat broccoli. My wife eats broccoli. She's probably eating it at home right now because I'm not there. People who eat broccoli banned from teaching in the public schools for turpitude clearly renders them unfit to be in the presence of God. Okay, so in the same way, there are kinds of sex that I personally find completely unappealing, even actively unpleasant. An example of that is a fetish that's called adult diaper play. This is a fetish where grown-ups like to dress up in diapers, they like to dress up like babies, and do sexual activities with this. Totally turned off by it, not interested in even trying it. Who cares? Who cares what I think about it? Nobody's asking me to do it. If they are asking me to do it, I'm just going to say, no, I'm not interested. That's okay, let's do something else. And if the people who are doing it are consenting, if they're happy, if this brings them joy, then what possible business is it of mine? I'm not interested in doing it, and I completely, 100% support and encourage anybody who does. It's really common for people to do this dime store psychology about other people's sex lives. Sexual masochists have guilt complexes, and sex workers have poor self-esteem, and what was the one they used to say in the 50s? Homosexuals have domineering mothers and absent fathers. It's really not very helpful. The reality is that we really don't understand sexuality very well. And particularly, we don't really understand what causes people to have different sexualities. We're beginning to get a very broad sense of that maybe when you talk about broad sexual orientations like homosexuality, bisexuality, heterosexuality. But even that's just kind of this soup. It's like reading tea leaves in a hurricane. And when you're talking about more specific sexual desires and fetishes and interests and so on, we have no idea. It's almost never as simple as that old Freudian thing about, oh, he saw a pair of ladies' shoes at an impressionable age, and that's why he's had as a shoe fetish. We all saw ladies' shoes at an impressionable age, We were all crawling around on the floor looking at everybody's feet. Not all of us became foot fetishists. The causes of sexual desire are very complex. It's multifactorial. I think that's what the social scientists say. We don't understand the degree to which they're inborn or learned or a combination. And those causes could vary from person to person. What makes one person be a sexual masochist might be different from what makes somebody else be a sexual masochist. And so apart from really obviously, grossly immoral acts like rape or child molestation, sexual desire is a really lousy barometer of personal moral character. And we have to remember that when we're tempted to make moral or character judgments on people based on what kind of sex they like. And whenever I'm tempted to do that anyway, whenever I'm just sort of being really super squicked about somebody else's sex life and I'm really tempted to make a judgment about who they are because of it, I always have to remember there are plenty of people who are super grossed out by what I do sexually. Even by things that I know are entirely consensual and safe and bring everybody involved joy. And I can guarantee you that that is true for every single person in this room. No matter what you are doing sexually or not doing sexually, there's somebody in the world who thinks it's disgusting. There are gay men and lesbians who are profoundly revolted by the idea of heterosexual sex. It's like, oh, gross, how can you eat that? There's people who think that celibacy and asexuality is unnatural and wrong and unhealthy for anybody. So if I want other people to respect my right to make my own sexual decisions, again, of course, as long as they're consensual and fair and don't hurt anybody, I need to extend that same respect to other people. And I need to not treat their private sexual practices as if they are a personal affront to me. And this principle of separating aesthetic judgments about sexuality from moral ones, it doesn't just apply to how we treat our strangers, and it doesn't just apply to how we consider larger questions of sexual morality in society. It applies to how we treat the people that we're sexually involved with. If we don't like porn, and our sexual partner does, we don't get to just say, porn upsets me, therefore you are a bad person for enjoying it. If we want our relationship to be monogamous, and our sexual partner doesn't, we don't get to just say, non-monogamy freaks me out, therefore you are a bad person for being interested in it. And similarly, the flip side of that is also true. If we are interested in porn or non-monogamy or bondage or whatever, and our partner isn't, we don't get to accuse them of being unadventurous and uptight. We have to accept that our partner's views are as valid as ours, again, assuming that they're grounded in basic moral framework. We have to accept, hey, if it's ethical, what you want is as valid as what I want, and we have to work out a compromise that works for both of us, that's based on respect for both of our desires, or again, depending on the kind of relationship we're talking about, all of our desires. We need to base those decisions on principles of consent and honesty and fairness and harm, and not on the principle of what grosses us out. So these are some ideas of atheist sexual ethics, some ideas of how we can use sexual morality without believing in a God who's telling us who to boink and how. And these ideas are not coming out of nowhere. I would love to convince you that I'm a super genius and I came up with this all by myself on the plane here in Texas. But they're not. These ideas are coming out of a groundwork of work that many people have been doing for many decades, and to some extent for many centuries. There's been this sex-positive community of writers, activists, educators, researchers, therapists, artists, and just ordinary people in their everyday lives who are advocating for this non-taboo-based approach to sex. And this sex-positive community has been loudly and passionately opposed to the conventional religious view of sex. The view that God really cares who we have sex with and how, and that we should base our sex lives on his checklist. And yet, while the sex-positive community has vehemently rejected the conventional religious view of sex, To a great extent, it's done this not by rejecting religion altogether, but by embracing alternative religion, and by bringing their positive view of sexuality into their spiritual beliefs. The sex-positive community is very often a very spiritual community. That there's like sort of progressive Christianity, progressive Judaism, and also lots of woo. Lots of Wicca, goddess worship, shamanism, tantra, astrology, tea, and so on. This kind of New Age belief, as well as the progressive, traditional belief, it really permeates the sex-positive community. And these spiritual beliefs are often not separate from the sexual culture. They're often very twined into it. And so that brings me to the second part of my talk. We've been talking about how atheists can view sexual ethics without religion. But how can we frame sexual transcendence without religion? What alternative can we present to the religious view? How can we acknowledge and indeed celebrate the power of sex to transform consciousness, to take us out of time, to transport us out of ordinary physical experience, to connect us really powerfully and intimately with each other in a way that can feel almost telepathic? How can we acknowledge that and still view it as an entirely physical, material, non-supernatural experience? How can we view sex without religion? And not just sex without traditional religion, not just sex without the capricious, vengeful, petty God who's obsessed with the details of people's sex lives at the expense of actual serious ethical questions. The God who's punishing people for having anal sex, but who's not, who's not stopping floods and droughts and so on. But how can we view sex without key energy and the immortal consciousness of the universe and honoring the goddess without pleasure and so on? The materialist view of life in general and sex in particular, it's often viewed as cold, as bleak, narrow, mechanical, reductionist, and just generally a downer. How can we offer an entirely atheist, entirely materialist, positive sex-positive philosophy that's warm, rich, meaningful, intimate, and joyful? So I'm not going to offer dogma here. I think ultimately we all need to answer this question for ourselves and for one another. But I was invited here to talk about this topic, so I'm going to take a stab at it and talk about some of my own views on this. Okay, so the materialist view says that there is no supernatural world at all. There is only the physical world. And all these things that seem non-physical, thoughts and feelings, choices, selfhood and identity, transcendent sexual ecstasy, consciousness in general, all of these things that seem non-physical, they are actually products of the brain's interaction with the rest of our bodies, and product of our brains and the rest of our bodies' interaction with other people and with the rest of the world. We don't yet know exactly how this works. Obviously, the science of neuropsychology and understanding how consciousness works is obviously still very much in its infancy. The overwhelming evidence, though, whatever it is, this is how it is. Whatever consciousness is, it's physical. And to me, this is not a downer. This is magnificent. This idea that out of nothing but earth and water and sunlight, these wildly complex living beings developed. Not just with life, and not just with the capacity for consciousness, but with the capacity to create the experience of ecstasy and joy for ourselves and one another. That is jaw-droppingly astonishing. We can create the experience of joy, the experience of deep, expansive pleasure that takes us out of ourselves and into one another. And we do it through a complex rearrangement of the energy of the sun and the atoms and molecules of the planet. That is magnificent. More than any other spiritual belief I ever held, that makes me feel both humble and proud. And that makes me feel intimately connected with the rest of the universe in a way that no spiritual practice ever did. What's that old hippie song about how we're stardust made of billion-year-old carbon? You don't have to believe in metaphysical energy to think that that is wicked cool. We are made of stars. And out of stars, we have created consciousness and joy. That is amazing. When you look at human beings, not just from a materialist perspective, but from an evolutionary perspective. You know, not as special spiritual entities or children of the goddess, but just as another twig on the very huge evolutionary tree. That view puts sex squarely front and center in the human experience. Sex has an immensely important place in the evolutionary scheme. Darwin wrote an entire book about sex. Why does sex feel so good? Sex feels so good because sex evolved to feel good. Sex feels amazing because evolutionary forces strongly favor animals who really like to fuck. That's an oversimplification. If there's evolutionary biologists in the audience, they're going, that's an oversimplification. It is. You know, for one thing, evolution can also favor animals who are picky about their sex partners, and obviously not all reproduction is sexual, but it is a huge part of the picture. Now, of course, for human beings, and for human beings especially in the 21st century, birth control and other non-reproductive sexual practices, they've been shifting this picture somewhat for us. You know, increasingly, we've been putting reproduction into our conscious control, and we've been, you know, separating it somewhat from sexual pleasure. And that's not to mention the reverse of that, which is non-sexual reproductive practices such as in vitro fertilization. And I am totally fine with that. I am down with that. Without getting into too much inappropriate detail, my own sex life is entirely non-reproductive. I'm a lesbian identified bisexual who doesn't have kids and never wanted kids and isn't going to have kids. And in any case, I had a hysterectomy last year, and you know, my ovaries had their shot and they blew it. And I'm fine with that. I am entirely in favor of sex shifting away from its original evolutionary function. In fact, I would argue that many of the most beautiful and valuable parts of the human experience happen when we take really basic, really deeply rooted evolutionary forces and transform them into something far beyond simple matters of survival and reproduction. You know, we took our animal need for palatable food, we turned it into chocolate souffles. Or, as the case may be, Texas barbecue. We took this ability to make and use tools, we turned that into the Apollo moon landing. You know, we took this uniquely precise ability to communicate through language, we turned that into King Lear. And I would say that the same is true for sex. We've taken this hardwired evolutionary urge to replicate our DNA, we have turned it into an intense and delightful form of communication, intimacy, creativity, personal expression, and love. Regardless of whether any DNA gets replicated in the process. But it is undeniable that these evolutionary forces, the evolutionary force to replicate that DNA, that's where the roots of sexual pleasure lie, and they're roots that go back hundreds of millions of years. Okay, so in other words, according to this materialist viewpoint, the capacity for transcendent sexual joy is hardwired into our brains deeply and powerfully as a crucial and central feature of our lives by hundreds of millions of years of evolution. And there's a lot of things that means. One of the things it means is that suppressing and trivializing sex is really stupid and futile. It's dangerous and harmful. It's a cruel, pointless crusade against this deeply laid grain of our nature. It means that, but it means something more. It means that the act of sex and the experience of sexual pleasure connects us to every other living thing on Earth. We are the cousins of everything that lives on this planet. We have a common ancestor going back into the primordial soup billions of years ago, and we are all related, not entirely, but substantially because of sex. That is awesome. That makes me want to stop this talk, get on a plane, fly home, and have sex with my wife right now. Just so that I can feel this connection with my fish and tetrapod and primate ancestors. And finally, when you don't believe in God, and when you don't believe in any sort of afterlife, when you believe that this short life is all we have, then making the most of that short life and taking advantage of the joyful experiences it has to offer, suddenly that becomes a lot more important. It's almost a moral obligation. As Richard Dawkins so eloquently pointed out, the odds against you personally, having been born, are beyond astronomical. The odds against that sperm and that egg happening to meet at that moment, and you being born, and then multiply that with the odds of your parents being born, the odds of their parents being born, the odds of their parents, that is beyond astronomical. You personally are astronomically unlikely. All of us are. Are we going to waste that life by not giving ourselves and one another as much joy as we possibly can? Okay, now this doesn't mean, as many anti-atheists would claim, that without a belief in God or an afterlife, we would just behave entirely selfishly and with no moral compass. It doesn't mean that even a little. We covered that in part one. What it does mean is that we can base our morality, including our sexual morality, on how our behavior demonstrably affects people in this life, and not on how it, supposedly affects invisible beings in a hypothetical, unproven, and unprovable life after this one. And it means that, as long as, again, we don't cause harm, as long as we're adhering to a basic core sexual morality, it's not only acceptable, it's a positive and meaningful good to engage in any activities that bring us joy and epiphany and meaning to ourselves and to the people around us, including and maybe especially sex. In other words, I don't think we need to see sex as spiritual in order to see it as transcendent. I don't think we need to see sex as blessed by the goddess, or a telepathic connection between souls, or a channeling of the key energy, or as any sort of worship or spiritual practice in order to see it as valuable and special and precious. I think we can see sex as a physical act between animals and still see it as deeply, richly valuable and meaningful. I think we can see sex as a physical act and still see it as an act that connects us intimately, not only with ourselves and with one another, but with all of life and with the expanse of history and with the vastness of the universe. Thank you. One or two questions.
What exactly does sex transcend when you say that it's transcendent? Would that question take an answer?
Okay, no, I can answer that question. The question is, when I say that sex is transcendent, what exactly are we transcending? And there are actually people who say, well, you're not transcending because transcendent implies that you're moving out of the physical plane into the spiritual plane. And that's not what I mean by it. What I mean is that sex can transcend us out of sort of ordinary experience. You have your ordinary daily experience, and you just cut it along, you're going to the grocery store and so on. You just have ordinary experience, ordinary consciousness. And sex can help you transcend that and, feel a sense of a larger connection with the universe, a greater intimacy with other people. So it doesn't mean transcending the physical plane, it means transcending the sort of ordinary daily quotidian experiences. Ordinary feelings and ordinary consciousness, yeah. Other questions? And questions should be questions, and they should be short.
I'm just wondering if you think that, I know what you mean about the woo and the sex positive thing. I've read a lot of that. And do you think that maybe just like they have residual guilt from the Judeo-Christian background, that the woo kind of gives them permission to enjoy themselves?
Yeah, so the question is, what drives this desire to experience sexuality in a sort of more woo spirituality instead of just woo beyond it? I think there may be a certain amount of residual guilt. I don't know if guilt is exactly the word I would use, but what I think it is that we're very steeped in this idea that to be religious or spiritual means to be good. That that's what it means to be a good person, is that, and especially if you believe in the spiritual world, being connected with that world makes you a better person and a larger person. And so I think when people start to let go of traditional religion and traditional religious morality about sex, but they still kind of have this idea that to be spiritual in some way means to be a good person, and that to be not spiritual means to be a bad person or an empty person. And so instead of rejecting spirituality entirely, the way that they frame sex positivity is they say sex isn't positive because it's secular or because it's material, that sex is positive because of the spiritual way of framing sexuality in a positive way. So that's what, I think it's a little more complicated than that, but that's what I think is the core of it.
And that's all we got time for.
Okay, thank you so much.